Hi, and welcome to This Week in Guns. Firstly, this is a new style of sort of topic reporting that I'm trying out here on the podcast. So send me your comments and suggestions on what you think about this style as compared to, say, the individual stories that I've covered, generally speaking, in the past. I only stick to one or two. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Should I make it a regular spot on the show? What other topics should I be covering? Things like that. This has been a huge week for gun critics and enthusiasts alike. Just yesterday, an enormous and resounding, I'll call it a win for gun legislation supporters on both sides of the gun debate, has passed the Senate floor, gone through Congress, and has been approved by Biden in what is being called a landslide bipartisan victory.
We're considering a bipartisan bill that will make our country safer without making it any less free. This is the sweet spot.
We'll talk about that one in just a little bit and discuss what the bill actually means in terms of the effects it will have on gun owners. I, for one, already like what I'm hearing about what they're saying about the common sense claims, but it is still very early. I've always been a fan of guns, but I've always also been a fan of making sure that people are sane enough to have them. And I know there's some debate in the gun community about this, so hear me out when I go over that story. But in any case, I have liked what I've heard about that. The NRA, I'll call him spokesperson, the lobbyist within the Senate, has already sort of given it the stamp of approval, as have, a couple handfuls of other, maybe even three handfuls, actually, of other Republicans on that side of the aisle. So we'll talk about that, and we'll be watching that as the weeks roll on. And another story, women gun owners will come up actually twice in this week's edition of This Week in Guns. But in an awkward turn of events in Minneapolis this week, women are also, I guess, seeing a renewed headline in a case that a female cop who shot and killed Dante Wright, thinking that she was deploying a taser instead of her service weapon, has been sentenced. We'll talk about that in greater detail. Gun-related murders by cops in Chicago have gotten so out of control that it is now officially against department policy to engage in foot chases where the likelihood of a shooting will take place. I'll discuss that in further detail as well, since the inspiration for this new rule has come in the wake of several teens being shot in the back by cops in pursuit. People who support cops and people who just are dead set against cops alike will have something interesting that they'll find in that particular story. Just 3 days before this article was slated to be published, a man in Texas was shot and killed while trying to rob a gun store with a knife. Talk about your all-time justifiable reasons not to bring a knife to a gunfight. That's going to be a good one to talk about. And in this edition's Hero of the Week, we have not one but two brave souls to celebrate who saved lives by lawfully exercising the Second Amendment. And here's the best part. These heroes were both women. That's right. This week, I am so humbled and honored to be able to tell the stories of these wonderful women exercising constitutional protections provided to us by our founding fathers. And why are you not hearing these women's stories on NPR or CNN, I wonder? Is it because guns save lives? Or is it maybe because these heroes are women? And we absolutely cannot celebrate women who use guns. That would just, send the wrong message to the woke sheeple of the world. We'll close today's talk with that discussion. Oh, and I almost forgot. I might just have a bonus part in there somewhere. I'm still deciding on whether or not to include it. It kind of depends on how long this this episode gets, since it is my first one and I'm still sort of figuring the ins and outs of it. It's kind of a good news, bad news story, and then also has some more bad news, but with like a hint of hope. Mysterious, right? Welcome to This Week in Guns. First up is the new gun bill to have passed the Senate floor and, as of this morning, was signed into law by President Biden.
For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Congress has passed a major gun safety bill with bipartisan support.
A good number of the voting Republicans have joined their Democratic neighbors across the aisle in Congress to pass a gun bill that is said to be the biggest in D.C. in more than 3 decades.
Just moments ago, the Senate successfully passed a major bipartisan gun safety bill for the first time in decades.
The first reports coming out of D.C. are that the gun bill addresses what Texas Senator John Cornyn calls common sense issues.
I think we've threaded the needle away in a way that protects the right of law-abiding citizens, but tries to get at the root of the problem that produced this shooting in Uvalde and has produced similar shooting elsewhere, and I think ultimately will save lives, and to me that's the ultimate test.
But what's common sense for most people these days is largely what's being fed to them as common sense by the media. So I'll be taking a look at the bill itself and seeing if I can make any sense of that in a later edition of This Week in Guns. I'm sure we'll have plenty to say by next week. My first reaction, kind of like my knee-jerk reaction right out of the gate, however, from the initial reports coming out, are that the red flag laws are actually being supported by this bill. And I was kind of surprised to see that with everything else that I'll call it was supported, passed, etc. These are troubling law. If you don't know about these, okay, these are troubling laws that basically translate to someone being able to call in the name of any gun owner to police, meaning they can just call in, say, John so-and-so threatened me with his gun. He brandished in front of me yesterday. The police then can show up at their house and take that person's guns. They can do this without warrants, without any adjudication by the courts, and therefore, of course, without due process. This has been the biggest problem that earlier bills have been shut down for in the first place. This is, of course, an unconstitutional law, if I've ever heard one. Of course, I understand the argument on the other side. We certainly don't need to be losing domestic partners, to situations of violence. But how those bills in the past have been coined, been written, been pushed forward have not been equitable for both sides of that particular debate. And I think what they're saying is that they finally found a bill that does kind of answer both sides of that. We'll see. Again, I'll take a look at it.
The compromise package does not include all the broad measures Democrats sought, but it does include a variety of significant steps, from increased funding for mental health to more comprehensive background checks for 18 to 21-year-olds.
The next is heightened background checks for mental illness. I've always been in support of this. I was involved in a school shooting. I feel very strongly that the individual who killed the people in my school was suffering a mental illness at the time. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can enact violence in a mass shooter type scenario, especially against kids, unless you have something wrong with you mentally. I think that should be sort of a de facto understanding. But in any case, it will be difficult to know right off the bat what the government actually defines as a mental illness that might prohibit gun ownership in the sort of the wake of that decision. I'm sure a lot of it will be hashed out, but we'll see what happens there. As someone with a learning disorder, as I am, this is a little bit troubling that I could be lumped into the same pile with people who have mental disorders. Obviously, a learning disorder is not a mental disorder, but I'm hopeful that this doesn't include me and others like me. I guess, again, we'll just have to see how that goes. So I'll be watching that one very closely, that part of it. The initiative also cites funding approvals for communities and schools to better protect themselves. So long as it doesn't mean a militant presence or like a militarized police force in these areas, I'd say that's a good idea. We'll see what that looks like. I think if the freedom exists in this bill to let individual communities and states decide for themselves what they actually want in terms of seeing protection and what that has the look and feel of in their individual communities, I'm all in favor of it, because what will work in communities in California will not work in communities in Chicago, say. And we need to be very particular on how we implement letting the government into our communities even more than they currently are. Just my take, my opinion. In fact, to further that opinion a little bit, I am in favor of like an armed neighborhood watch or an organization of armed community members. It's, separate from the police, or maybe like including off-duty police or whatever, like anything to bridge the community, I think would work there. And even having community members do armed volunteer watches in their children's schools with body armor and like radio dispatches to connect them to law enforcement and school administration. I mean, those are very common sense answers to lessening the load, or lightening the load rather, on police and drawing stronger connections with the communities and certainly the schools, which have literally been under fire recently. I actually did a podcast about this. It's called How to Solve School Shootings Like Uvalde. And if you haven't heard that one, check it out. I kind of detail that theoretical initiative in greater detail there. While I'm certain that funding is not appropriate in the bill for the kind of thing that I'm suggesting, I'm more sure that it likely translates to just, stationing armed, uniformed people at these locations. But again, we haven't seen this in action, so we'll see what that looks like. Then, of course, there's the increase in scrutiny for purchasing guns by age. The various researching agencies on gun violence have apparently found out that younger citizens are more likely to be involved in active shooter scenarios. I cannot talk today for some reason. And that part of the bill will hopefully address that concern. I don't know the research. I haven't looked at that particular part of the research in general. As the bill grows and time moves on, I may be including more of that in following weeks. But I suppose all of that, how it affects gun buyers, and of course the statistics on how this part of the bill potentially changes those statistics, remains to be seen. So I'll just keep an eye on it as it evolves. I hate that I can only report that much, but the bill is pretty new. Perhaps the most contentious part of the bill that nearly shut it down actually was the language that it included about a, quote, boyfriend loophole.
And it includes one key provision that almost tanked the whole deal.
Operating under the boyfriend loophole.
The so-called boyfriend loophole continues to be a challenge.
We're going to close the boyfriend loophole.
Leaving aside for the moment that calling it a, quote, boyfriend loophole, which assumes that men are the only abusers in domestic relationships, earlier attempts to thwart this so-called loophole were all shut down because they bypassed another right that sets the American system of governance apart. And when I say that, I mean it sets it apart from other countries where basically anyone at any time can make any claim about anybody else without a shred of evidence and see that person thrown in jail, or in the case that Democrats want to see happen, have their gun rights taken away. And I mean permanently. They are going after your rights. They've even said it.
We're going to make sure that every domestic abuser, whether it be a spouse or a boyfriend, has their guns taken away.
And see how they're saying that there, spouse or boyfriend? They want to permanently ban anyone's rights to possess a firearm. And again, when I say anyone's in this particular case of this particular quote unquote boyfriend loophole, it's not called a girlfriend loophole, right? It's not called a domestic partner loophole, but rather it's called a boyfriend loophole. So they are literally targeting men in this quote unquote loophole.
People who beat up their girlfriends have lobbyists fighting to preserve their ability to buy guns.
The research is clear that both wives and girlfriends kill their significant others in huge numbers across the U.S., and anybody who debates that is flat out lying to you. I have plenty of research on the article for this to back that claim up. In fact, according to the Office of Justice Programs within the Department of Justice, for every 100 men who killed their wives in the United States, 75 women killed their husbands. Okay. This is a staggering statistic when you consider the fact that the left would have you believe that men kill women at a rate of 9-1. And by the way, most left-leaning news outlets, when they're talking about this data, they're citing a very popular HuffPost article from 2016 that skewed the data from a study by the Violence Policy Center, stating, quote, the report found that in 2014, over 1,600 women were killed by men. The most common weapon used was a gun. During the same period of time, there were only 15 instances of women using firearms to kill a man in self-defense. Let that sink in. 15. Okay, so I'm just going to go back over this in case you missed it there. They plucked one fact that men had killed women with guns. Then they plucked another fact that women used guns to defend themselves. Then they put these facts together in a sentence that would have you believe that there were only 15 instances that in the entire year of 2014, women used guns the same way men did. I'll read that again and keep this in mind as I'm saying that. The report found that in 2014, over 1,600 women were killed by men. The most common weapon used was a gun. During that same period of time, there were only 15 instances of women using firearms to kill a man in self-defense. Let that sink in. 15. They're not comparing two equal data sets. If they were, they'd be citing the number of times that both men and women used a gun to defend themselves. Or they'd be citing an instance where both men and women used a gun to offensively kill their partners. Instead, they're citing the number of times that a woman defended herself against any attacker, right? Any attack, not just the husband, but any attacker, with the number of times that any man used a gun to kill a woman. Again, not even citing the wife. This is how people skew statistics, right? They left out that finicky little detail about how often women kill men outside of self-defense. That number is actually quite different. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that that was not what HuffPost wanted to say in that article, so they just sort of conveniently left that detail out, all while sort of claiming that, oh, we are telling the truth. Well, yeah, you're telling one truth that was found in there, one statistic. But you're not saying the whole thing. They're not really willing to say that. But I am happy to share that with you. And here it is. According to a study that I found, not on the internet, but which I had to go into my paid subscription to LexisNexis and find, and which I will cite in the article for this podcast, the DOJ's Office of Justice Programs, report number November Charlie Juliet 175688 from 1999, found that between 1976 and 1997, which is a 20-year period, women killed more than 60,000 men. That's 3,000 men a year and a little over 8 per day on average. Now, if the HuffPost reported that, right, in the lead up to their 2017 data, might have given a different impression. Perhaps even worse than that was that the FBI investigation from 2016 that studied 10,000 familial murders, in other words, like murders within the family, that study found that 41% of those charged were women. That's close to half. And that's just charged with murder, right? That's not findings outside of defensible activities, right, per the incident. Now, I can cite these statistics all day long. I can keep going down this list that confound the leftist agenda on gun rights. In fact, I'm a journalism professor, so that's kind of my job. I teach, aspiring researchers all over the world how to read into the agenda of news and find the right information from the most reliable resources to combat that information. It is wild once I remember back to even my earliest journalism years. In taking journalism classes, by the way, you're going to be taking them from liberal campuses. Journalism is almost innumerably more vast in its leaning to the left. It's another conversation for another day, but that's kind of where you're going to learn from. Unfortunately, though, for them, that when they teach you how to find the right statistics, they also teach you how to find the right statistics that don't necessarily work to push forward their agenda. So in any case, that's what I've decided to do. I take that, world of knowledge and put it into a podcast that you're listening to right now in hopes that we can at least balance that out. I'm really not even trying to push an agenda. Like, I'm really just trying to defend constitutional rights. That's really all I'm doing. And when those constitutional rights are challenged by, I'll call them institutions of media, like the media agencies of the country, that's a problem for me. So yeah, I'm going to fight back. And I know how. So in other words, you're being lied to by the woke media monster with a very limited scope of understanding for the ability of its audience to think critically and for themselves. And of course, I'm talking about you right now. They are banking on the idea that you will remain ignorant so long as they tell you what to believe. But that's a podcast for another day. To bring it back to the discussion at hand, obviously there was enough pushback from Republicans that the various powers that be agreed that the previous versions of the boyfriend loophole violated a number of rights, including the right to due process. That and the red flag gun laws, which are simply boyfriend loopholes that extend to non-domestic partners, will be an item many Second Amendment supporters will want to watch for in the future. With that said, however, on the very same day that the gun bill was pushed forward, a long-standing unconstitutional gun law that's kept New York citizens unarmed in the face of steadily rising crime in recent years has also been dashed. It's a pretty big win, actually, for gun right advocates in New York and all over the New England states as well. In fact, I'm willing to bet all the way down to Pennsylvania. There's frequent travelers that are affected by this. The gun law that's allowed many criminals to get away with carrying handguns and also making ghost guns in New York, but which has also kept law-abiding citizens living in fear of those lawbreakers, has finally been shot down in a Supreme Court ruling this past Tuesday. Biden shot back pretty quickly, enforcing his stance on the Second Amendment, but he made no comment on the long-standing effects it had on citizens living and traveling in the American Northeast. Even for anyone driving through New York with guns in their vehicles or on their person, criminal charges could be filed against them, and they could have their property seized. And since New York covers the entire landlocked access from every state in New England to every other part of the country, that means every single driver who happens to transport their guns between the two regions of the country are hindered under these laws. And that's a big number if you don't know. I've traveled through there several times, and knowing the laws, I'm pretty actually concerned about, or at least I was. We'll see how it goes from here forward, but there were a point of concern at certain times. According to Hudson Valley criminal law, it is illegal for anyone without a valid New York gun permit to transport a handgun, whether loaded or unloaded. And that's a direct quote. And of course, according to New York's lofty restrictions placed on who and how gun permits are applied for, you're not only required to be a resident of New York to get a gun permit, you're also required to have or plan to open a business for which the gun permit application is being submitted. That's just, if that's not a setup, I don't know what is. That's so anti-constitutional. It's kind of hard to say that in one breath and not just be aghast by it. Yeah, in any case, not just New Yorkers obviously are affected by that and have suffered through that era of staunch anti-constitutional, anti-gun legislation. The long outmoded law that the state government in New York has been relying on for violating the Constitution's view of gun ownership for more than 100 years is a 1913 ruling that required New York citizens to show, quote, proper cause in order to get a license to carry a gun in public spaces. 1913. That's more than 100 years they've been violating people's constitutional rights, and the Supreme Court just confirmed that. Since then, the requirements have steadily grown more robust, not easier, by the way, as the years have passed. At this point, according to New York, in other words, ny.gov, like newyork.gov's permit requirements, the list of requirements for that gun permit are as follows. First, you must be a New York state resident. You must be 21 years of age. You must have no prior felony or quote-unquote serious offense convictions, which can and undoubtedly has been used to avoid approving permits in the past. You must be of good moral character, which is also a matter of opinion. You must have a legal and recognized reason for wanting to possess or carry a firearm, and you must be ready to open the business for which the license is being applied. Several of those just stumble all over each other and are clearly subjective per the, county in which you apply. I'm sure that's just wreaked havoc for gun owners there. Nevertheless, these requirements are about to change since the Supreme Court's decision was a 5-4 vote in the state legislature that the right to bear arms applied to New York under the 14th Amendment. And for those of you wondering, the very first section of the 14th Amendment states, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And it is for this exact language that I think the New York Supreme Court's decision will be used as precedent in other states, or at least that's the hope. But reeling it in for the purposes of the gun bill discussion, this new revelation for New York, which will almost assuredly have an impact on other states, is almost as momentous as the newest gun bill to be approved this morning. The first major Second Amendment decision from SCOTUS in more than a decade. Even so, the New York Post reports that the Supreme Court's decision on the matter is, quote, disappointing. Quoting Mayor Eric Adams, who's already fretting about how to ensure the city won't become, as he puts it, the Wild West, and promising to work to, quote, limit the risks that this decision will create. I'm not sure where he's going with that, since like New York's got some of the harshest gun laws next to like California, and yet they also have the highest crime rates. We'll see who's right in the end, I suppose. Perhaps the changes in the outdated New York law have come in light of the surging gun violence throughout the state that I have linked and cited in the article. Please go and read that as well as listening to the podcast. And centering, of course, in the capital city. I'm thinking, of course, that because law-abiding citizens have, for at least the last century, been abiding the law, and even with that being the case, crime has only steadily increased, it may be time for another experiment. I don't know, say to actually abide by the Constitution, and instead of gambling on the U.S. government to protect us, we be trusted to protect ourselves. Because let's be honest, folks, the leftist agenda is not just, hey, let's get more government. It's saying to the government, we can't trust ourselves to make the right decisions. Daddy, please come help me. Help me make my own decisions in the privacy of my own home, and then tell me what I can do outside of my home. This, after all, was the entire point of seceding from the British Empire in the first place, which was clearly going to continue pinning us down under tyrannical rule. Please don't forget your history here, folks. I say let the games of citizen ownership begin. When it began in the 1700s, I think we did pretty well for ourselves. We have led the free world. So I think we should dig up our history and make sure we understand what we did it for and keep that at the forefront. But be careful as we go forward into this new era for New York, because there will be a lot of statistics coming out of this next era for New York that will undoubtedly be, I'll say, skewing the facts as they have been in order to scare the bejesus out of every member of society so that they can do the whole I told you so thing and repeal this new landmark decision. But as you're listening to these statistics, be careful not to get lost in the fact that this new flurry of news, as it comes at you, keep in mind that they also swept a glaring hate crime under the rug by a deranged man who was clearly not legally in possession of his weapon when just 3 months ago he enacted carnage. Don't remember that one? I'll jog your memory. A 62-year-old black Pennsylvania resident named Frank James boarded a New York subway and fired more than 30 rounds into the crowd, making contact with 10 of those victims. And yet, instead of allowing the subway goers to arm themselves, New York's antique laws made them sitting ducks to Frank James's wrath. James spent years posting racist material on social media linked to black identity extremists, extremist ideologies. These would include the Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, Black Liberation Army, BLM, and of course he was a frequent poster of the image of the black nationalist cop killer Micah Johnson. And instead of calling this what it is, which it's clearly racially motivated hate crime, New York insisted that it be called an act of terrorism, and that's what he's been charged on.
Frank James faced a judge for the first time today, and prosecutors say he is the one who shot 10 people during the morning rush in Sunset Park, Brooklyn on Tuesday, unleashing the type of attack the city has not seen in decades.
Prosecutors allege that Frank James had access to a stockpile of ammunition and other dangerous items in his storage unit. The judge ordered James to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. He is charged with committing a terrorist attack on mass transit.
Even with that being said, though, Frank's attack was just one of nearly 10,000 crimes committed just so far this year in a crime wave that's being hailed as historical in New York's lineage. The crime wave has drawn so much attention that it's the inspiration for a new plan rolled out just this week in an attempt to focus on the homelessness and violence in the subways and other areas of high crime. Those are linked in the article as well. ABC News did an in-depth article on the, I guess, suspected motivations, we'll say, for why more guns are being carried by citizens and the relationship that has to the, like the increase in gang violence and the decrease in police involvement. And that's also linked in the article. And much of this is policy driven, since in the wake of a spike in killings at the hands of police, people have gone from voicing concerns to all-out rioting in the streets in order to pressure change in the courts and in police department policy and things like that. Stick with me for a couple seconds and I'll get right into the story of Kim Potter and her conviction for shooting Daunte Wright. When she was convicted, Kim Potter was still claiming that she didn't know she'd shot Daunte Wright with her service weapon rather than her taser. While the court did not find that Potter's mistake warranted a complete dismissal of her charges, they did give her a much reduced sentence. I'm assuming the fact that she was convicted at all had quite a lot to do with the protests going on leading up to and including the final days of that trial. Whatever the case happens to be, the city of Minneapolis has to be getting tired at this point of doling out tens of millions upon tens of millions of dollars to the families of victims shot and killed in that city's police department. And the family of Daunte Wright is simply the most recent. Since Derek Chauvin's trial, the city has paid out $27 million to the family of George Floyd, another $20 million to the family of Justine Damond, who was shot by an officer named Mohammed Noor, I believe, who responded to a 911 call, or who I think Damond approached his car with hey, there's something going on here, and he shot her, right? Noor was later convicted on similar charges to Potter. Perhaps after all that, the mere $3.2 million that the Wright family has received in a settlement payout from the city is a consolation for their losses, but I seriously doubt that they feel quite as satisfied by the fact that Potter only received 16 months in jail for twice as many convictions, including first and second degree manslaughter. Now, I did a little research on this and found out that where her sentence lands against the standard for charges of this type is not necessarily where it should be. Now, obviously, 16 months for 2 counts of manslaughter doesn't seem quite adequate for anyone, but there is some politics behind it, and I'll get into that. But I found out that according to the Schaus Law Center in California, the maximum sentence for even one conviction of first-degree manslaughter as averaged across the country is a decade in prison. And Potter's sentencing then might, I don't know, seem like a slap in the face perhaps to the family of Daunte Wright, as her conviction entailed 2 manslaughter charges in total. The plot thickened, however, when it was revealed that Daunte Wright had a warrant issued for his arrest at the time of the shooting, and the charge for which Wright was being sought was for aggravated robbery. And this is where the rubber meets the road, folks. When you're listening to the news and you're like, oh my God, they shot and killed a white guy, a white whomever officer shot and killed another black guy. We need to just take to the streets. I'm not saying that in every case we shouldn't be voicing our concerns and that there aren't unjust cases out there. Absolutely, Derek Chauvin deserves to have his neck crushed while in prison. I'm like the callous look on that douchebag's face while he was killing George Floyd. Yeah, he deserves everything he's getting, and he got a very harsh sentence. But when we fast forward that to Kim Potter, by the time she got to court, they shouldn't anyway. I'm sure they do allow, to some extent, though this might not be provable, pressure from the public and pressure from the media to force convictions, force charges, etc. But they have to still look at the facts. Okay, these are times when it now moves from people's opinions on the outside to lawyers whose job it is to research everything that's going on. And when it's there, they do things like look at the actual circumstances. They have a collection of privatized information at their disposal. They have video and surveillance items that aren't necessarily available to the public, at least not until after investigations are complete. Those investigations are called discovery, by the way, in court. And so that's how they're supposed to be basing their legal opinions. And since I'm on definitions, Daunte Wright was sought for aggravated robbery. And when aggravated it was used here, that's kind of putting it nicely given the nature of the incident that I'll describe in a moment. But the word aggravated is used in the courts to process charges that involve or include a weapon of some sort. And that, of course, can be anything weapon specific, of course, like a knife or a gun, to any other object that can be used to cause harm to the victim, which can include things like, hammers, baseball bats, stuff like that. In fact, in my latest documentary, I filmed the plight of a small town activist who was so hated by the local government that they tried several times, very, very unsuccessfully, embarrassingly unsuccessfully, to convict him on felony aggravated assault. And the thing that they named as the weapon in the obviously conjured incident was a forklift. A forklift that goes like a maximum of speed of like 5 miles an hour. It was a crazy addition to an already crazy film about nuclear level civil rights violations in this tiny desert town in Southern California, Arizona border. You can check that out at legallyinsanefilms.com/films. You can also go to legallyinsanefilms.com and click the link for that movie. It's called Big Trouble in Little Quartzsite. Out of that sprung a podcast, so make sure you don't click the podcast, but you actually click the movie link for Big Trouble in Little Quartzsite, or you can just find the direct link to the film that I'll put in the article for this podcast. According to a warrant obtained by the Daily Mail, which is a digital rag published out of the UK, Wright had violated his parole and failed to appear at a hearing related to this aggravated burglary. The report also indicated that his information was known to Potter before Daunte Wright was killed. This puts a whole different spin on the story that we're hearing in the U.S., since the original charge stemmed from Daunte Wright having held a woman at gunpoint and robbed her of $820 that she'd taken out and cashed to pay rent out of her paycheck. She was walking home from cashing her check from a Cash Now place to pay her rent, and she was pistol whipped, held at gunpoint, and robbed by Daunte Wright. Obviously a very violent scenario played out there. The bond set for that warrant at the time of his shooting was $100,000. Okay. No light amount. In other words, 4,000 miles away, the news story broke of a violent criminal who the state wanted so badly that they issued a 6-figure bond for his capture. And during the pursuit, he was killed. But in the U.S., the story we heard, which was spun by the liberal mass media that clearly has an agenda to start riots, was that another black man was shot by yet another white cop, and justice translates to that cop going to jail. Far be it from me to say that I have an opinion on matters revolving around race and violence. I've spoken about this quite a bit. But when we're talking about race and violence in the media simply needs to cover it. It just needs to cover all the facts. And frankly, the facts reported in Britain included that Potter knew Wright was a violent offender and acted on that knowledge. Here in the States, we were given the woke media rhetoric that Minneapolis is a breeding ground for white cops targeting innocent black males. He was neither targeted nor innocent. And that's the narrative we were given. And this happens all the time in every single demographic, every single one. It just so happens the most contentious ones happen when these particular races are involved in a killing. A white cop and a black, usually black male, right? I mean, the Breonna Taylor shooting, that was messed up. I probably should do a podcast on my opinion about that. But in most other instances, rioting begins when a black male is shot by a white cop. And yeah, whether or not the outcry for Daunte's killing was simply fueled by recent police violence, or if the majority of those in support of Wright's family were even aware of his crimes at the time, is not currently known, since I was only able to find out this information through deeper digging in my VPN to search overseas hits for this murder. However, little remains to be available from the major networks that, in the States anyway, clearly dominate public access to news and information about the case. There's clearly a defining item there that we need to be addressing. It's not even really race. Like, I keep saying this, and I feel bad even hearing myself say black male killed by white cop. It's really not about that. It's just about journalists need to cover the facts. I mean, I think journalism is an all-time low. And I'll give you a history of journalism real quick, since I'm on my little soapbox here. The history of journalism actually started so that there were political rags, right? It started flat out as muckraking. It's an actual journalistic term that describes a politician's initiative to start a newspaper and get the word out, not about what he, and largely it was male. I don't think there's a single case at the time when newspapers really were used this way that described a female candidate in her campaign, but how a male's candidate, how a male's opponent in a political campaign was just a horrible person. And they flat out lied. There was no like journalism ethics at that time, right? I mean, newspapers were brand new. And the first thing, I'm pretty sure the reason they were invented, or at least, widely used, was to spread rumors about a political opponent. And that's called muckraking. It elevated one or two steps up to what's called yellow journalism, but that still wasn't very good. And I think, frankly, we're back to the muckraking days. We're just a little smarter about it. I have known this since my very earliest days in journalism. I got my journalism degree from IU, the prestigious journalism school, the School of Journalism at Indiana University. And I actually do think it's a very good program. But from 2005, when I first started my program, I knew about the history of journalism and how it really kind of came up and crept into politics, how it was used by politics to manipulate the status quo opinion of opponents in politics and things like this. But I can't recall a time prior to that when I knew this. Obviously, I didn't know the history of it because I didn't study it, but I didn't know that you really just get to say what you want in the news. There's really nobody out there, even the government, that's going to come at you, because the first thing that's going to happen is major media news sources are going to sick their lawyers all over it and say, you're violating our First Amendment. And technically they'd be right, because everybody has a right to say what they want, especially across mediums. I'm exercising that right now. And a lot of what I'm saying is my opinion, right? I could be in someone else's eyes extremely wrong, but my opinion, I have the right to say that, right? And they're exercising that same right. But the creepy part, the part that I really disagree with, right, is that they're skewing facts. They think they're pulling the wool over people's eyes, but the more indie journalists that come out and talk about the real shit, right, what they really know about what's going on, and they find other sources, the more it's revealed that they're really just slyly, thinly veiling their attempts to push off opinions as fact and push off an agenda as a moral imperative. And they're wrong in so doing. They're just wrong. I advocate for constitutionality. That's what I will always default to. I'm realizing that I'm just jumping off on this soapbox here, but I'm really trying to keep it together, I promise. But every time that I see this, whether it doesn't matter to me what race anyone is. I'm not a racist. I'm not even going to defend myself against racist claims. I've never been racist. There's never been a claim of racism against me. And of course, white cops killing black citizens or suspects is not the only crime that's happening out there. And you should be offended by this, because not only is it creating a fear of cops, and especially a fear of white males, it's also creating horrible problems in our societies where these two demographics are not to be untrusted. I mean, just because I'm a white guy doesn't mean I've got something, you need to be worried about. And most cops are absolutely to be trusted. Like, these are isolated incidents, and they're so crazy that they make the news. They're so sensational that that's why they make the news. And here's the other thing. There are crimes that happen the other way. There not only are situations where, black cops shoot white assailants or white suspects, right? But there are Mexican cops who shoot Mexican assailants, or black cops who shoot Asian assailants. And like, all of that exists across the demographic spectrum. It happens. The problem with all that is that those are not being reported. And even when they are reported, because they're, extra sensational or whatever, they have no images of the suspects. They have no, if it's an ambiguous name, you'll never see a picture of a mugshot on the news right underneath the headline. It'll just be some like generic picture of a scene or something where it took place. You're being lied to, and you're being used to up the advertising dollars that the news agencies are able to bring in. And they do that quite well. And that should just deeply, deeply offend you. Crime happens everywhere, and it needs to be reported in all the facts in all the situations. And here's the other thing. I totally agree that our culture painted blacks in an inordinately bad light back in previous years in journalism. I absolutely do. Looking back, remember thinking after like half an hour of news, I just remember being so worried about like gang violence affecting me in my tiny little town in Kentucky where I went to high school, where it clearly was not an issue. But I just remember that physically altering my interactions with my black friends, like, or just generally with black kids that went to that school. And I hate that media culture did that. I hate that media culture did it. And most probably at that time, media culture was headed by white males. I am willing to put a hell of a lot of money on that fact. And I'm positive that when blacks today look back to that culture, they're thinking the same thing, and they're right to think that. Because I only remember having a couple of black friends growing up, and we moved around a lot, and that probably had a little bit to do with it. I had friends though, and most of them were white. I had a couple of Asian friends. The black friends that I did have, and I'm not, I feel bad even like pointing out that I had black friends, like, oh, look, he's not a racist, he had black friends, but they were good dudes, right? When I think back and I compared what I saw on the news, as naturally somebody would do with my friends, my question was like, yeah, they're good dudes, but like, the news says they're bad people. Are they gonna like wait till they've got me alone and rob me? Like, these were concerns that they have, or that I had. I was worried, I was concerned, and I was made concerned by media that I watched. That's, I guess, what it comes down to. And these guys, they grew up to be good men with good families. They work hard, and they deserve respect. These are the same stories that I can pick off from all of my friends that grew up where I was at. Okay, most of them. Some of them, I'm thinking maybe they got out of their mom's basement. Some of them are probably doing meth, but for the vast majority of my friends, they got off their ass and did shit, and that's great. And I hate that the news culture that white males and white cops are experiencing now, right? I hate that experience of being overcovered of their crimes, blacks being overcovered in their crimes, is now the precise reversal of what news culture did in the 90s. Right. What blacks have experienced in the 90s and probably a good part of the early 2000s. Now there's another demographic experiencing. But the problem is that what news culture did, while it was wrong, the thing that will make it right is not just turning around and choosing another demographic to do that to. Even if, by the way, that was the demographic that headed the news back in the day. Just because there are other women and cultures now leading newsrooms, it doesn't mean, okay, well, it's time for you to get your just desserts, because like nobody that they're doing it to headed their newsrooms. Like, if you want to really get back at the people who did it, do it to the people that headed the newsrooms. If you really want to kill the messenger, kill the right one. And by the way, there's plenty of horrible news happening in America every single day to go around. There's plenty of news to cover. But the thing that will fix ethical journalism is not harping on one demographic or another. It is, for once in the history of journalism, to employ ethical journalism at all costs. News networks need to grow a spine and stand up to woke culture and report all the facts in every case where newsworthy events affect their communities across the board. They need to put morals in front of advertising dollars, and they need to grow a pair and do the right thing. I think that the first major network that that does that, I think they'll have respect from both sides of the political divide, and hell, who knows? They might even get respect from the Green parties and the Libertarians and all the rest. So like, I mean, I think the first media company to stand up and actually do that in the face of all of this, the public pressure, the woke culture, advertisers like running the other way. Advertisers, here's the other thing about advertisers. They don't care about the actual news. The only thing they care about is the numbers, like who's watching, right? So then that translates down to, and the news media knows this. So what are they going to do? They're going to follow the patterns that they know are popular in that moment to get the eyes, to get the eyeballs on the screen and to keep them there, which is what fear mongering is all about. And when I see media sharking over these like frenzied attempts to basically start a race war, they're calling us stupid. They're saying, look, believe what we say. We're going to keep you in fear so you're glued to our TVs. And once you're glued to our TVs, by the way, we'll throw a couple of commercials in there for you to be good little bitches and buy our advertisers' goods. So we can keep doing more of the same. I mean, that vicious cycle, it needs to stop. It really, really does. And it happens on both sides. It happens with like a lot of people like NPR and Fox News, and that's like CNN versus Fox News. That's a divide, but they're both guilty of it. Every major media outlet is guilty of it. I feel like I should stop now. There are clever ways that they do it. And at least they think they're clever, but thankfully the American public is getting smarter about the media they consume. You're listening to this, so clearly you're a genius, Actually, that's kind of a hidden faux pas. Like if you found this, it's because you're out there looking for other journalism. So you actually are pretty smart. In any case, reeling this back in a little bit, it does seem that there was no problem for British newspapers to obtain the police records revealing the entire timeline of the events detailed in the arrest report. That has been linked to the article. Also, the warrant issued against Dwayne Wright. Check the article for that. The timeline and the arrest report are quite revealing. And whatever the case, let's close this one off here before I pick it back up and take off with it. The settlement and the lackluster jail sentence are likely the result of courts attempting to balance out the public outcry for the officers' knowledge of the facts in the matter. All right. Before I go on to a new policy in Chicago policing, that's the next story. I'm going to go ahead and pause here for another break. But on that note, I should say that for the ad-free version of all my content, including this podcast, head over to legallyinsanefilms.com and click join the fan club. You'll find this podcast. You'll find the Legally Insane News Show. You'll find a once monthly ultra high quality audio show that I call Small Town Justice. And of course, you'll also get access to my documentaries. It's definitely worth going over there and supporting. Speaking of not catering to advertisers that infringe upon the news that I'm getting out to you today. Now on to a story about new Chicago police policies on foot chases. In an NBC News report that came out the day after the conference that revealed the new rule, officers, quote, won't be allowed to chase people on foot if they're suspected of minor offenses such as parking violations, driving on a suspended license, or drinking alcohol in public, end quote.
So the new policy that we put out today is clearer for officers, and I think it's a lot easier to understand.
The jury's still out, of course, on whether or not this means that people stopped for these offenses will now take it upon themselves to just sprint in the other direction to avoid being charged for a crime. But for now, I think this has been enacted so that it will avoid some travesties that are already sort of taking place.
In March of last year, Chicago police chased 13-year-old Adam Toledo down a little village alley. He is shot to death a split second after he tosses a gun behind a fence. 2 days later, 22-year-old Anthony Alvarez is killed by police under similar circumstances in Portage Park. Now a CPD foot pursuit policy developed in the wake of those shootings has been finalized.
Let's face it, just like any other rule that has a gaping potential for loopholes, these loopholes will be exploited. It comes back, however, to what's generally better for the greater half of public good in terms of citizens dying as a result of outmoded police policies regarding the use of force. And again, I should state that just because a policy exists in Chicago does not mean it will, do well in Rhode Island or Virginia or wherever else. I mean, they have their own problems and they're trying to deal with those. And I applaud them for doing that. I mean, this is one step in the direction that finds a middle ground.
According to the new policy, an officer should only start or continue a pursuit if there is probable cause for arrest. Body cams must be activated. Pursuits are prohibited for minor traffic violations and can be terminated at any time by supervisors. Finally, officers must consider alternatives.
I'm not sure where I land, frankly, on the city's decision to enact this policy, but I can say that Chicago has routinely made bleeps on my radar when I've looked into violent crimes over recent years. They always seem to come up as a place, kind of like a hot ground for police-related violence, police-related crimes, and things like that. Baltimore is another frequent recent outcropping there. Specifically, Chicago has extremely tight gun laws that might prohibit normal citizens' ability to defend themselves in a city where homicides are among the highest in the nation.
The impacts on crime has been studied, and we can look back at foot pursuit policies. It's made officers safer, and it's made the community safer.
It also helps bring the city into compliance with a federal consent decree.
Fundamentally, what this comes down to is having a policy that makes sense. This has now been signed off on by the judge, by the monitor, by the attorney general. So I think it's a very solid plan.
But in the past, critics of the policy have said it keeps cops from doing their jobs.
Yeah, you got to do your job constitutionally.
Very, very concerning numbers coming out of Chicago. And just like New York, they've got really staunch gun laws and they have really high rates of crime. These two are undoubtedly related. There's an undoubted correlation. You can only have so many cities have that ratio before you start paying attention to that. In fact, in just the first month of 2016, 316 homicides were reported, many of which were the result of gun violence. But New York City, to continue that comparison, it's 3 times the size of Chicago, and it's only had 244 homicides in the first half of the year. So I'm not saying they only have 244 homicides. That's a horrible number, right? But to have less homicides in 6 times the amount of time as a smaller city, 1/3 of its size, that speaks volumes for the violence happening in Chicago. That's undoubtedly gang related. I'll do a little research and maybe I'll cite some references there. Whatever the case happens to be, I'm sure that we'll see a lot more statistics coming out of the Midwest's largest city as this policy is put to the test. The policy was also apparently long awaited. It's a subject of some hot debate in recent months by Chicagoans demanding change to police activities that have allowed so many police-involved killings to go down. In fact, it's both inspired from and very closely aligned with the earlier draft of the measure, which the AP reports, quote, among its rules, the new policy prohibits foot pursuits for minor traffic violations, bars officers from separating from their partners if they can't see the suspect they're chasing, or if the officer or the suspect is injured. Under the new policy, the chase must end if the officer has lost track of their location or their surroundings, or if there is too great a distance or too many obstacles between the officer and the suspect that they're chasing, and if they're not able to control the suspect of the chase in a confrontation. I think that last sentence there, as if they've lost the ability to control the suspect of the chase in a confrontation. That part of it I agree with. I have no idea what Chicago police challenges are on a day-to-day basis, and I'm not going to pretend to speak for those. I'm not going to generalize. They probably go through a hell of a lot, and if I have any police from Chicago listening to this podcast, I applaud your efforts. That's got to be a tough nut to crack. I used to live in Chicago. I got out of the Navy in Chicago. I know exactly what danger lurks there, and it's very serious. Even if the statistics didn't reflect that, it's serious. They didn't mean business out there. I don't know why Chicago wound up being that place either. Like, why such a breeding ground for gang violence and things. But in any case, that last sentence spoke to me because I recently did an article and a podcast about Patrick Loyola, who was killed by Officer Christopher Shore, and he was on the ground. The cop just flat out shot him in the back of the head. He was on the ground. He was, I don't know if he was ever a threat, but he certainly wasn't a threat when the officer was on top of him. He had a little more to go until he wrestled his hands into cuffs, but he just shot him in the back of the head. I mean, there was no danger to Patrick himself. There was no danger to anybody standing by. There was no danger to the officer. I don't think at any point anybody was actually in danger, and the officer just shot him in the back of the head. Kid bled out right there and is left his parents childless. By the way, they were immigrants from the Congo. You imagine coming to America, having a cop shoot your kid? Yeah. My heart bleeds for that kid. I just, that's so much was wrong with that. Reeling it back in though, I think it's possible that sort of scene has played out in Chicago at least a couple of times. We'll have to kind of see how the statistics on that play out as that policy is put to the test. Moving on to a knife in a gunfight. And one of the funnier, though no less sad stories that you'll hear on This Week in Guns, a homeless man robbed a gun store with a knife or, quote, sharp object and was killed at the scene. Last Tuesday, an as yet unidentified man had apparently gone from store to store stealing items in what I can guess from the description in the articles I've read about this was a strip mall, which Carter's Country Gun Store was attached to. He apparently attempted to steal a pair of jeans at one store before being ejected from the Sweet Mart for a minor attempted theft. The suspect then went into the gun shop where he didn't see anybody and walked right behind the counter. He opened the register. He began stealing money out of the drawer. And that was then the point where the employee walked out from the back of the store and was allegedly confronted by the suspect. And that's kind of where the story gets fuzzy. But the employee, who was also unnamed in the story and who later indicated that he was in fear for his life, shot the suspect once out of 2 reported shots fired in the incident. The suspect then stumbled out of the store and collapsed in the parking lot. He was transported to a nearby emergency medical facility where he later died from his wounds. No word on whether or not that suspect made any statements or if he was unconscious. I don't know what the story is. The Houston gun store, however, is no stranger to attacks. In 2016, Carter's Country was the object of a concerted burglary attempt when a Ford F-250 pickup truck backed up to the entryway doors when two men hopped out with a chain to chain the doors to the truck. The truck then drove forward to rip the door from its hinges. Security footage of the event shows masked burglars smashing display cases and ransacking shelves. The suspects got away with more than 50 weapons in the heist, but they didn't get very far. Within days of the incident, police arrested all the known suspects to the crime. The current case in Houston regarding the knife-wielding suspect is not yet finished. However, Lieutenant Larry Krausen, who spoke for the Houston Police Department, said that the case has yet to be presented to a grand jury where they will decide on whether or not the employee truly acted in self-defense or if the very lenient stand-your-ground laws in Texas will find that they acted in malice. Most probably they will be found having acted within the bounds of the law, especially in Texas, and especially since the man had just got done robbing other places. On a personal note, here's the thing about this, folks. Anybody wielding any weapon of any kind who has a clear intention of doing harm absolutely deserves to be shot. Arm yourselves, people. These are strange times. In another story that I'm insanely proud to report on, 2 women gun owners have not once this week but twice saved the lives of plenty of people by shooting and killing deranged assailants who clearly intended to unveil carnage. You probably won't hear about these stories in the anti-Second Amendment media channels, however, but you will hear it here where we actually have the balls to defy the woke zombie hordes. 2 women made waves this week with their heroism in the face of violent threats. I'll break these 2 stories down individually. The first is in a case in, I believe it was West West Virginia. I got my notes down here. I'll go through it. In a case that's just as important to those hoping for more gun control as those who support deregulating gun sales in America, a hero is likely to go unsung in the headlines around the country. This particular hero was a woman who chose to go unnamed in the news coverage of the event, where she saved countless lives before a shooter could even injure a single bystander. But they got a few shots off. It all happened at a graduation party in Charleston, West Virginia. See, I was pretty close. When a man named Dennis Butler reportedly appeared with an AR-15 style rifle and started firing into the crowd, which included students and their families. The unnamed woman, who was lawfully carrying her pistol at the time, fired on Butler before he was able to injure anyone at the event. Butler got off plenty of rounds. None of the rounds that either of the weapon-toting persons at the scene connected with any of their well, okay, how do I say this? The AR-15 did not make contact with any people, and the lawful gun owner at the time, I believe all of her shots impacted their intended target, and he was killed at the scene. According to police who responded to the scene, Butler had not only been stopped in the area for speeding and had been given a warning that children lived in the apartment complex where this all took place, he also reportedly had, quote, an extensive criminal history. Just looking at the list of news publications that cover the story, all that can be found in my initial search were Fox News, Breitbart, Yahoo News, USA News, The Blaze, USA Today, and the Police Tribune. These were the major outlets. Everything else, well, I guess we could call the Police Tribune a major outlet. Everything else included local stations and like independent publications and blogs that had non-syndicated digital rags, basically. And of those major media outlets, all of them happen to be right-leaning publications that support and report on lawful gun ownership. Nowhere to be found, however, were reports of this story on NPR, CNN, Grist, The Intercept, 538, Vox, Novara, HuffPost, The New York Times, not even the AP. There were so many publications that refused to cover this story on the left side of the mass media divide that I will suffice it to say the pattern is clear. No one wants to know that guns save lives on the left. They don't want to know it. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want anybody else to know it or talk about it. This is the pattern. And the pattern is the same as the message, and that is that lawful gun owners in this country stop deaths and violent crimes. It's happened to me twice. On 2 occasions in my life, I had a handgun at my access. I think both of the times it was on me. I was carrying. I pulled it once. I've never fired my weapon. I've never shot it at a suspect or someone coming at me. But once I saved my own life. Or I at the very least saved myself from a beating from 3 black males that had gotten out of a car. They were teenagers. I was very young. I had just gotten out of the Navy. I was in Texas. They were rolling around. They came up on me and a friend of mine. My friend ran one way. I ran the other. I was chased. I stopped a confrontation with my pistol. I have no idea how far it would have gone, but I told that dude to back off, and he sure as hell did. The second time, I actually saved a car full of people. I don't want to go into that one because I might actually do a podcast episode on that later. And there was also a third time where I had just a night before this happened, I had lost someone broke into my car. Due to one of the United States Commonwealth states, won't name which one, one of the two, they had laws against going into bars with guns. And because of that law, I had my gun stolen from me. Someone broke into my car. They stole my pistol, which was in the glove box. And then the very next night, I was jumped by 2 guys that put me in the hospital and broke the orb over my right eye. And they had just got done, by the time they got to me, they had just got done jumping and kicking the crap out of a priest on his way home and stole his wallet. They eventually got these guys and put him in jail. But I kicked the crap out of one of them. Maybe I should do a podcast about this. I'll give you the quick story on that. I actually reached in my glove box and which is what I just have a habit of reaching in there, and then I realized, oh crap, it's gone. And I reached down below, and there was this big jar, what do you call it, a bottle of tea. Before, this was back in, I think, early 2000s, probably like 2002, maybe 2001. I had an Arizona tea, a big bottle of Arizona tea in the baseboards. It was empty. I had finished drinking it and I put it down on the the footboard. I grabbed it and I came back. The black, there were two guys. One was white, one was black. He came at me, hit me right in the face when I had opened my door. I was getting back into my car and opened my door. I sat down in the car and he was right on top of me, hit me in the face. On the same motion, I reached down to grab the bottle and I smashed it over his head. I didn't realize at the time because he and I went back and forth boxing. This guy must have been on crack or meth or something, because I'm a big dude and I was pounding this kid, and he just never went down. His buddy got behind me and choked me out, and they kicked the crap out of me while I was knocked out on the ground. But when they arrested the two guys, the black guy who I had sliced up, they told me that he has a permanent second smile. They said that he has what looks like a second smile, like the Joker, but like underneath his chin. Like it goes from one side of his face to the other, but underneath and across his chin where his chin meets his neck. I almost cut the dude to death in one fell swoop. But had I had my service weapon, my concealed and carry pistol, and had I been able to exercise my constitutional gun rights, I would not have lost the pistol, and I would have had not had to go to the hospital that night. I probably barely made it. I don't know what they did after me, but by that time I passed out. But that's my personal story about that. So I'm forever going to be a fan of the laws that allow us to legally carry under various circumstances. But that's what the left media doesn't want you to hear. That's what they don't want you to know. They would be perfectly happy. Like, they would be not impacted in any way had I died all those many years ago. And if you want another example of this, I'll give you one. A second story this week of a woman refusing to become either a statistic of violent crime or another victim left behind in the leftist media agenda to keep America ignorant of circumstances where guns save lives. ABC Action News reported on this story, surprisingly, that a home invader was shot and killed. In that report, they did not name anybody's race, but it happened in a neighborhood in Clearwater, Florida, that I'll go into. That'll probably become apparent. A Clearwater, Florida woman woke up in the middle of the night to find that her 26-year-old neighbor, Justin Wright, had broken into her bedroom. She claims that Wright had broken into her house and began attacking her in her sleep by the time she retrieved a legally owned firearm and shot him.
Details tonight on a shooting that left a man dead. Clearwater police say it all started on a home invasion.
A resident at that location had reported that a gentleman had unlawfully entered the residence, and a struggle and attack ensued. She was able to reach out and call 911 during this attack, but the attack persisted, at which time she was able to retrieve a gun that she had lawfully purchased, and she used that gun to defend herself and fired one shot, which resulted in the death of the intruder.
For the full audio of that Q&A session with the police chief investigating the shooting, stay on after my outro, and I'll include that on the podcast. Obviously, the emotional state of the victim in the case was of concern. It was asked about several times, both by reporters at the Q&A with the chief presiding over the case, as well as on the scene when nearby residents were interviewed for the news report, the broadcast. But oddly enough, I don't recall ever hearing news reporters asking about the emotional state of men who have had to shoot intruders in their homes for protecting themselves and their families. But maybe that's a flop, right? maybe that has nothing whatsoever to do with the social expectations between men and women. The men's part, of course, being emotionless soldiers in times like these. And, not to go too far on a tangent on this, but I'm curious if women are finding that they're slightly offended at the notion that they're expected to be, frail and soft and, and that it's a complete shock when they kill a home invader, right? That, or I wonder if they're at all shocked that the reverse expectation is true of men who undergo the exact same scenario. Why are women treated like weak little frail things? I mean, two strong gun-owning women stood up and saved the lives of countless people. And it always comes down to, not always, I shouldn't say always, but it has come down to their emotional state. How are you? Can we do something? Shouldn't it be important to ask that of men? I don't know. I'm just thinking in journalistic terms, like how I would report this. But I'll just leave it at this. It's food for thought, but I think we should be applauding the efforts of all of those who defend themselves and their neighbors and their loved ones and people attending graduation ceremonies and stuff, and caring for the stability of everyone in the aftermath of such situations equally. I'll leave it at that. Call me crazy. I guess it's just something I've noticed. I hope you notice these sorts of things too. If you listen to this show and then you go off and you listen to major mainstream media, I just hope that you become very critical media consumers and think for yourselves rather than letting mass media at large create a process of thought for you. Quit contributing to the social isms. Women are not weak. They're strong. They're tough. They're badasses. They clearly have what it takes to take care of business. So stop treating them like princesses and start treating them like the queens that they are. That's my opinion on the matter. Also, you may find another thing interesting about that Q&A with the chief that I'm kind of stitching into the end of this podcast here. I've never heard the chief mention the race of the suspect.
We responded to 1639 Flagler Drive with regard to a shooting that just occurred. A resident at that location had reported that a gentleman had unlawfully entered the residence.
And this is what I was kind of alluding to earlier as far as balanced journalism goes. What's even more surprising, no one, not a single person from the reporters pool asked that question either. Stay on after the podcast is done and listen to the whole Q&A. There are no questions of the man's description at all. They didn't ask how tall he was, if he was a small man who wasn't able to maybe handle himself in the scuffle, and that would have had an impact on any injuries that the woman might have sustained. They didn't ask about if he was a large man, and therefore perhaps more questions might have surfaced about any serious injury to the woman. Even though the perpetrator has a criminal history in other states, as confirmed by the police chief in the middle of that talk, not a single news outlet put his mugshot on any of the news reports that I could find. I have no confirmation that the assailant was black, but one thing that you'll benefit from knowing about the video taken from the neighborhood by the news agency that broadcasted it, every single resident in the area that was recorded for the report happened to have been black, right? It's nobody's prerogative that black folks commit crime, right? Nobody wants black folks to commit crime, but when we're whitewashing it and we're stepping right over it in the news media, to the point that it's keeping us from even asking about a description of the assailant so that we could find out more information about what potentially happened to the woman or what maybe his motivations were, right? It was mentioned that she was a new resident and the neighbor might have just been like watching her go in and saw that she was a single female, and yet no mention of no requests for information on the man's description. Is that just an understanding now? Am I missing it? Is it just an understanding between the police chief who's given the Q&A and the reporters? We just stay away from those questions? Those of you who have heard my reports in the past know that I'm not trying to spark any kind of anti-race sentiment in these stories, but rather an ethical journalism debate. Ask yourselves the following question. When the public is forced to do their own research, including filing public records requests to find out the details that affect them in their communities and in their areas, where history has proven that the vast majority simply won't make that effort and they'll stay ignorant, is it journalism truly doing their jobs? Has the journalist that you're watching on TV or reading in the news or listening to on a podcast really done their job if they're not reporting on the full story? And if not, if the answer to these questions is no, why have we started reporting stories that only report facts that support the woke narrative? That's the very next question that should follow in there. And that is the end of my soapbox for the ethical journalism debate. I'll just let it be known that I'm extremely proud of these two mystery women that stood up and shot their assailants to protect themselves while exercising their Second Amendment right, while keeping other people alive. to go and every single person has this woman at the graduation party to thank for the rest of their lives. They should both be applauded no matter their race, and technically also no matter their gender. But I'd still like to see more cases where women like these two show the country why private gun ownership is still important. And you know what? Since I'm already celebrating great women doing good things in the world, why not celebrate the valiant efforts of yet one more? This time, a Latina swimming coach from Team USA dove in to rescue a female artistic swimmer by the name of Anita Alvarez, who fainted in the last half of her performance and sank to the bottom of the pool in front of a live viewing audience.
An American artistic swimmer was dramatically saved by her coach after she lost consciousness and sank to the bottom of the pool during an international competition. According to the Olympics website, 25-year-old Anita Alvarez had just finished her performance in the women's solo free routine at the International Swimming Federation's World Aquatic Championships in Budapest, Hungary on Wednesday when she began to sink. Her coach, Andrea Fuentes, immediately jumped into the water fully clothed to save her. In photos of the dramatic moment, the 39-year-old retired Olympian is seen swimming to Alvarez in order to bring her to the surface of the pool. There, she was joined by another swimmer who helped complete the rescue. According to the Olympics site, Fuentes told the Marca newspaper that she jumped in because she saw no one else, including the lifeguard, dive in. The coach added that she got a little scared because Alvarez wasn't breathing, but now she's fine.
According to a statement by her coach, this was not the first time that the two-time Olympian had to be rescued from fainting in the water. The last time actually took place at the Olympic qualifying events in Spain. Probably the most compelling part of the story, however, is the photos that emerge. Just looking at them, they're both heartbreaking and sobering at the same time. You're basically looking, for those of you who go to the article, I'll post those, but you get a real visage. You're basically looking at a woman who looks like she's died, but in the stillness and the buoyancy of the water, the true lifeless form of the human body can be seen in all its glory. I mean, it's trippy to see this. I mean, it looks like it's straight out of a movie. Again, I'll link those photos here as well. I'll put in an interview with the man who took them. Very interesting story there. Also, just an FYI, this story was plastered all over NPR and HuffPost, whose coverage of female heroes and even trans swimmers is quite present on the web. Okay, before I get into that soapbox, I'll just point out that this is clearly not balanced journalism at work. But that's it for This Week in Guns. Be sure to let me know what you think about this new segment by finding my contact details in the show notes. And also be sure to keep listening after the outro that's coming right up to hear Police Chief Slaughter's Q&A with the reporters about that harrowing story of a female gun owner who ridded the world of another scumbag who had no business breathing your air. That's it for this edition of Legally Insane News. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Kyle O'Donnell for updates and extras on this and other stories. If you're listening to this podcast at legallyinsanefilms.com or the Small Town Justice page, be sure to also download the Spreaker app, where you can directly subscribe and help me bump up my download totals. If you like this episode of Legally Insane News, consider becoming a supporting member. For just $3, you can get access to members-only unreleased articles and podcasts, case files on our latest investigations, updates for events and conventions that we're attending, and discounts on swag. To do that, just head over to patreon.com/legallyinsanefilms. There are 3 different memberships, each with more content than the one before. This is where I release all of my documentary films with outtakes and extras, as well as another podcast called Small Town Justice. You can check those out by going to legallyinsanefilms.com and clicking Join the Fan Club. Send any questions, comments, feedback, and show ideas to thejusticepod@gmail.com. This has been a production of Legally Insane Films, LLC. I'm your host, Kyle O'Donnell. We'll see you next time.